All right, so here we go. This is going to be a very different kind of episode, I think. I hit a point here recently, just this year in 2024, when I realized, hey, wait a minute, man. I've really been missing out on a pretty significant, pretty major film franchise. All my life, basically, all these years, I somehow ignored it. And that film franchise involves maybe the very biggest, the longest running, the most impactful character in all of cinema history, right? I mean, come on, we could put it that way, I think. And that, of course, is Godzilla. How did I not pay attention to this film franchise for all these years? The reason it really struck a chord with me now is because of a couple of things. I saw Godzilla versus Kong, or Kong versus Godzilla, or whatever it is, a few years ago. And I was kind of impressed by it, but also really kind of disappointed in it because I just felt like it wasn't, I just felt like it started to turn into a comic book movie. It started to just go into straight up fantasy. And look, it's about giant monsters. I get it. So you've already got to buy into it somehow. But the sequel that just came out this year, The New Empire or something like that, I saw that, and I'll talk about that later. But what I'm seeing here more recently, just in the month or two since I saw it, is that it is apparently the biggest entry in this new monsterverse, right? These series of films from Legendary with King Kong and Godzilla. And to the point where it's pretty much greenlighting a third movie now in this Godzilla versus Kong, Godzilla X Kong, whatever. The other thing was Godzilla -1 came out. And I had only heard the title. I didn't have any idea what it was about. I just thought, oh, okay, the Japanese studio, the original studio, Toho, I guess they're getting back in the game because they haven't made a Godzilla movie in years. And even to the point where I kind of thought they were out of the Godzilla business, you know? But when -1 came out, and not only was it apparently successful, but it was actually critically acclaimed and even won an Academy Award. So that's where I thought, okay, now we're hitting a different kind of we're hitting a critical mass, I think, with Godzilla and this whole giant monster franchise, this genre of films, put it that way. And so that's what got me thinking. It's like, wait a minute. Okay, Godzilla -1 was hard to find. Like, you couldn't see it anywhere. And I think even to this day, you can't really see it anywhere. And Godzilla X Kong, I mean, it's taken off. It's become a giant hit. Really kind of unexpectedly, honestly, because I just felt like that series was kind of going downhill with each new film that came out. But then again, we'll get to that later. What it made me think, though, is like, okay, how many Godzilla films have I seen? And of course, how many King Kong films have I seen? But I think the King Kong ones, I've seen pretty much most of them. You know, I've seen the original, what was that, 1933, I think it was? You know, the original black and white King Kong. And I saw the one from the 70s, I think it was like 1976 or 78 maybe, with Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange. I remember seeing that. And of course, the Peter Jackson King Kong. And then, of course, these new ones that came out, Kong Skull Island. There was even one in the 80s somewhere. And I feel like it was called King Kong Lives. And so I remember seeing all of those films. And look, they're a little bit of a mixed bag. Some are better than others. And some have their own strengths, even if they're not the best films. But Godzilla, it occurred to me, it's like, wait, I just haven't seen that many of these films. Not as many as I thought I had. Because the films that I do remember seeing when I was younger, of course, were Godzilla 1985 and the original Godzilla from the 50s. And, my memory of it is, the one with Raymond Burr. But those aren't the real versions of those movies. So that's why I kind of thought, all right, wait. I got to go back to school here. I got to start over, basically, and go through this whole thing with fresh eyes and really try to understand it. Because here's the thing, too, is I don't really feel like I understand what's going on with these movies. And not because I don't understand giant monsters and all that, but I just feel like, especially with these legendary movies where they are really dipping into fantasy now, I didn't understand how much of an element that was with all of these films. And so, you know what? Let's do this. I'm going to start from the beginning. We'll start with the original Godzilla, 1954, and we'll go through that entire era. See, here's the other thing I didn't know. These Godzilla films, this entire franchise, it's over 30 films if you count all of the different variations and studios and all that. I think it's like 38 films at this point. And they're all basically divided into different eras based on, my understanding is, whoever is the emperor in Japan. And so the first era, which starts in 1954 with the original film, it's the Showa era. And that goes all the way through 1970, I think it's 1975. Then we go into a new era, which I think kicks off with the return of Godzilla. And that is the Heisei era. I think I'm saying that right. Heisei? Then after that is the Millennium era, which kicks in around 2000, I think, with Godzilla 2000. And now the more recent Reiwa era, which starts with Shin Godzilla, which came out in 2016 and now into Godzilla -1. To me, I always thought all of these films were connected. Like, I really thought they were all sequels of each other. That, and I didn't even realize how many there were. I mean, that was kind of mind-blowing to me. And so that's where I found out this franchise, this character at least, is the longest running franchise in film history. A lot of film franchises that are currently active today, let's say, they're not actually that old. I mean, if you think of like Marvel, there's a lot of films, but that's all within like the last 10 or maybe 15 years, right? And if you think of, I don't know, Harry Potter, let's say, that whole, franchise, even the newer prequel films or whatever, that's still not quite that long. And even if you go back to like Mission Impossible, that started in the mid-90s or early 90s, I guess. What else? Star Wars, we go back to the 70s. James Bond, you go back to the 60s. But here, I mean, this goes all the way back to 1954. This year, 2024, is the 70th anniversary of this franchise. That just blows my mind. I kind of took these films for what they were at the time. I just didn't have the right context, and I didn't really have the ability to see them all. And now, the age that we live in, I mean, you can basically see any of these films almost anywhere. So that's what I did. I said, all right, this fits in perfectly with what we're doing here, Film Streak. I'm going to go back and watch all of these films and really try to take them in and try to understand like what is going on, what this franchise means, and what it's trying to do, and maybe where it's going. So, my memory of watching the original Godzilla as a kid, because it must have been on television. I wouldn't have seen it in the theaters. But it was the version with Raymond Burr and his narration and his telling the story of what happened in Japan when Godzilla attacked, right? And that was kind of the version that was taught to us here in America. So we're going to go through all these films, and fortunately, thankfully, the Criterion Channel is coming through big time because they have an entire collection of all of the Showa era films. That starts with Godzilla 1954, goes all the way through to what was the last film? Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975. And look, I appreciate the effort to include all of the films. I can tell you that I didn't watch them all. And we'll get into the reasons why or how. But I wanted to really hit the high points, I guess. Hit the ones that I felt like had some interest. So, the first one I want to get to is, of course, the original Godzilla, the actual original cut, the Japanese version, which is significantly different from the Americanized or the remixed version with Raymond Burr. That's the only version I ever grew up with. So seeing this and really, because of time, just really coming to it fresh, like I really didn't have a clear memory of that other version either. But watching this pretty much with a clean slate, I felt like it actually worked better. I felt like it actually made more of an impact. And so, if you've seen this, of course, I'm sure most people at least understand the origins of Godzilla or the basic premise of Godzilla. This film is, of course, the one that really started it all. So we get maybe the most thorough explanation, at least in the sense of how the characters relate to this, We've got these, it's a small fishing village in Japan. They have the first sighting, and they're the ones that give it the name Godzilla because of an old legend. And the scientists, the community there, they try to figure out what this is, right? Like, what is this creature? And they're theorizing that it has to do with radiation from hydrogen bombs or atomic bombs, atomic weapon testing. And so it's an interesting way to look at it now because there's plenty of metaphors in this film for maybe the fears of a country, right? The fears of Japan and its people after World War II, of nuclear war, of nuclear fallout, of what that means, like just the trauma of it, of having an outside force just come in and devastate your entire society, right? All of those things are present in this film. And I'm sure it just hit the target right on the nose for the feeling of the Japanese people in that moment. But I even look at it today and feel like this still makes sense. It still connects. And maybe it's for different reasons, but I think a big part of it is this fear of the unknown, this fear of the kind of foreign presence, the foreign power that can change your life in an instant, and you have no control. You're helpless to do anything about it, really. And I think, look, if you even look at it this way, think about what we all just gone through here in recent years with COVID-19, the pandemic, and the amount of scientists and research and medical expertise that was needed to overcome that. Even if it's not fully, entirely, a thing of the past yet, but we have kind of returned to normal life for most people, right? But remember when it was at its height, right? Like 2020, 2021, where there was a large part of society that just was scared by it. And alternatively, you had another group of people that felt like, well, I still have to live my life and I still am going to go forward. And I might even have to ignore science and take action, whatever action that makes sense. And look, as divided as that made people, as that made society, it happened. And in this film, we even see moments of that where the government, the military, they have their own feelings about how to deal with Godzilla. Meanwhile, the scientists and the people who are maybe a little more empathetic, they're trying to figure out what exactly this is. Where did Godzilla come from? What is the purpose? Like, what can reasonably be done so that we don't entirely just kill a creature? But meanwhile, we have to do something. We can't just sit back and watch it destroy everything. Even to the point where there is a secret weapon, right? That on one hand, it is effective, but on the other hand, it is entirely dangerous. And in this film, they call it the oxygen destroyer, which sounds horrifying. It's not a thing you ever want to develop in a world where everybody breathes oxygen, right? It's not really a thing you want to have on hand. And I think that's the idea, is that, well, how do we fight this devastating force unless we also use some sort of devastating weapon of our own? And so that's where the film, I think, really shines. And it speaks to a real creative vision, I think, for telling a story, but using metaphor, using a little bit of fantasy, using a little bit of horror and suspense to really engage the audience, right? To really get people to pay attention. It's like, you've never seen anything like this ever. And that's where I feel like this film is really, it changed the game, it set the bar, it's done all the things that it could do as a film. Everything that's come after it is either derivative or a copycat, right? So, I almost feel like if this film would have just been one and done, it would have been a masterpiece. Because when we get to the following films, even the sequel, like a direct sequel, Godzilla Raids Again in 1955, that is, from what I saw, it is very clearly rushed. It is very clearly like haphazardly, maybe even lazily done, which I don't feel like nobody tries to do that, but I think it shows, right? And here we have Godzilla, who was thought to have died in the first film, returns, and we've got scientists who are trying to figure out basically what else we can do now. And then, of course, there's a new monster that's introduced, Anguirus, which looks like basically a dinosaur, which, that's the original theory or explanation for what Godzilla is. He's just like a mutated, overgrown dinosaur that has kind of come out of hibernation, let's say. And so here, of course, we have another dinosaur, right? And so then it becomes a little bit of a different dynamic. And I think this is where these films, this is where it can get tricky. And this is where things, I feel like, really go wrong. Because this film, it's the first evidence of it. And it's so obvious that this was going to be a problem. But at some point, it just devolves into monster versus monster. And we kind of leave the human characters behind. And I get it. There's probably a lot of people, a big part of an audience for this film, that's all they want to see. And okay, that's cool. But I just feel like that's what makes the original film so powerful. That's what makes me connect to it. Maybe that's what makes the difference between a classic work of literature and a comic book, right? One thing, it reaches deep inside, it really connects, it makes you think, right? It provokes you. And the other one, it's just a feast for the eyes, or it's just dazzling the senses. And then once you're done, you kind of move on. It doesn't linger with you. And here, Godzilla Raids Again, man, I tell you what, I got kind of exhausted watching it. Like it devolved into so much just monster versus monster fighting. And I'm watching it with today's eyes. So I got to say, it does not hold up. It does not look good. It's just two dudes in giant rubber suits just smacking each other around, jumping around, running, kind of flailing, really. Doesn't even look like fighting, doesn't look choreographed. It just looks clumsy. It looks silly. And it's hard to take. I mean, it's kind of laughable, And look, I did some reading about Toho, about the studio, and the dilemma, the situation that studio was in at the time. It only makes sense that they would say, hey, we put out a hit and we've got to still keep making money. So we got to turn another one around quickly. Because Toho in the 40s and 50s, it was struggling. Now, don't misunderstand. I mean, they've produced and are responsible for Akira Kurosawa and so much of his work, which, look, I mean, you're talking about one of the most enduring, one of the most influential filmmakers in all of film history. And all of his films that remain, that still hold up, that still have power, they all came through Toho at the same time. And as a matter of fact, 1954, that was the same year that Seven Samurai was released. So you've got Godzilla and Seven Samurai, and they both turn out to be hits. And of course, this studio, who is struggling to make its way, they're going to try and capitalize on that. I understand that. You might as well. So maybe rinse and repeat, right? And I just think something like this, it deserved maybe a little more thought of like, how do we move forward with this franchise? So, I take it for what it is. It's a film that was made probably in very earnest effort, but I just had a hard time with it. And so, look, there are other films that are happening in this time. I'm going to skip a little bit forward to 1962, Mothra versus Godzilla, because this is probably, along with Godzilla, one of the more known creatures, whatever, in this franchise that changes the dynamic again, but maybe in a better way. Because it's not just Godzilla running around destroying everything and people are kind of just helpless to do anything about it. Here we have another creature that is a rival, let's say, a peer, I guess, to Godzilla. But there is now a little bit of a human connection, and this is where it gets into fantasy, of course, because we've got the fairies, the infant island civilization that they have a connection. They have a bond with Mothra, and so they're able to communicate and telepathically guide and summon Mothra as needed, right? So at least that gives us another angle, and it allows the people in the film to do something. And so that's where I feel like, okay, well, here's a nice twist now, because, if it's just monster versus monster, I just feel like that's not going to get us very far. We've got to have some other kind of way into this story. And that's a problem you've seen in all of these types of films, this genre, let's say. Whether it's King Kong, whether it's even something like Pacific Rim or something like Cloverfield, hell, even the Transformers movies, right? Those are giant robots, but still the tendency that you keep seeing is to just go with those creatures or go with those characters and leave the humans behind. And I just feel like the best films that work in those franchises or in this genre, let's say, they still keep the people in the mix. The people are an important factor. I mean, Pacific Rim, at least the first one. I haven't seen the second one, but the first one, I feel like it hangs on the people. Like the creatures, they don't really have a personality. They don't really have a distinct, even a purpose. I mean, there is a thing that they're trying to do. But the robots, of course, they have no personality. They're just machines. It is the people that we are connected to. And that works. Even something like Cloverfield, where, the trick there is that it's all found footage. It's all first person. So not only are we keeping the people in the story the entire time, but we are basically one of the people. So that forces us to see it from that perspective. The monster really is just a thing. It's not a character necessarily. And, Transformers, I mean, we've seen that whole franchise has gone off the rails. And I think the only ones that have really connected are where we focus on the people first. And I guess the first one kind of does that with Sam and whatever. And, his teenage, mischievous kind of behavior and what is he going to do with this new car and stuff. And then we kind of get a repeat with Bumblebee. And I think those are the stories that still keep working. The ones where we follow other characters and we go off and we're doing things on other planets or other parts of the world or in weird machines and time travel and whatever the hell, that's where I just get lost. And I feel like that's most people, they just get exhausted by it. Because I'm like, I don't even know what we're doing now. And so, to bring that all back to this franchise, I feel like it's important that this stay in the mix. Like we have something interesting with our human characters because that is our connection as the audience. I can't relate to a 50-foot giant dinosaur lizard thing that breathes atomic breath. I can't relate to that. I can't connect to that. It doesn't even emote anything, really. So aside from that, the next film that I saw, 1964, is Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, which now changes the dynamic in another way. Because not only do we have the change of Godzilla going from this creature that is doing whatever, having its way with human civilization, and here we see Godzilla basically step up to become a protector of Earth in a sense. And, look, I mean, I can get into, this is where, of course, like all those great themes and those changes for the characters, those are all great and interesting to me. Of course, the mechanisms by which some of this is happening it's kind of silly. In Ghidorah, we introduce aliens that are going to essentially try and take over Earth by using Ghidorah as their weapon. And because there's so much of the film that involves space and space travel and other planets and other civilizations. And, this is 1964. This is before man had even stepped on the moon, before we really even understood kind of the nuts and bolts of actual space travel. So this is where we're seeing a lot of like really kind of antiquated, just fantastical versions of what space is like. Like it just, there is an effort to make it somewhat logical, but it's not necessarily realistic. And, if that's what you're looking for, I'm sorry. For me, I felt like it went a little too far into like, we're just making this up because we don't actually know, of course. We're still in that like Fantastic Voyage type of space travel, like the black hole or whatever. Those early movies of the 60s that they didn't really understand or have a grasp of the science that could be involved. So it's kind of like just make up whatever makes sense to you. But meanwhile, the idea of course, having a giant monster that is a weapon now becomes, all right, Godzilla is the one that steps up and teams up with Mothra and Rodan, which is not introduced. I didn't watch the Rodan film. I know other Mothra and Rodan, they came in with their own films and then kind of joined or became part of the Godzilla universe, so to speak. But here we're seeing these characters all team up to fight Ghidorah. And that's where I think, okay, now this makes a little more sense, because it's not just two random creatures fighting for some unknown reason. They have a little bit of a purpose now. I can at least connect to that. And so I follow that up with Invasion of Astro-Monster, 1965. And again, there's another one that involves space travel, Planet X, a moon, the 13th moon of Jupiter. Here's an interesting twist on the whole thing, is they want to borrow Godzilla and Rodan to fight Ghidorah. And in trade, they're going to give us a cure for cancer. Yeah, okay, we'll take one of those. We'll give you this giant beast that is tearing everything up. Take him. But of course, the deal is actually like a double cross or whatever. So not only are they going to take Godzilla and Rodan, but they're going to come back to Earth and try and take everything over with all these monsters under their control. I feel like this is where this franchise, I think for me, starts to really lose me. Like I start to feel it with this film. It's like I don't know how much more I can go down this road, because this is way different than what I thought it was. I mean, the thing I will say is the next film, Ebirah, Horror of the Deep, from 1967, this one actually brought me back in for a second. The beginning of the film, the whole opening, it doesn't feel like a Godzilla film. It doesn't feel like this is a movie about a giant monster. It is like the least Godzilla opening to any of these films, I think. And it's about these four guys, well, three of them, they're friends or whatever, but then they find this fourth guy who's kind of I guess a thief. They take this boat and they go out into the water for days. And, the thing that occurred to me though is like, wait a minute. This is in this Godzilla universe. Like people know about Godzilla at this point, but they go out into the ocean in this boat. They don't know how to pilot the boat. They don't even know where they're going. The boat is kind of just doing its thing. And it's like, why would you get on a boat if Godzilla kind of lives in the water? I mean, it seems to be a lot of times that's where he comes from. He comes from the ocean. The boat ends up sinking because it's attacked by something, not Godzilla. And these guys end up stranded on an island. And now at this point, we kind of loop back to the natives from Infant Island with the fairies, with Mothra. And these guys, they find Godzilla kind of hibernating like under a mountain, like in a cave. And because they want to get home, they don't really know what's going on here. There's like some other, I don't know if we want to call them terrorists or some other organization, some other kind of armed forces here that are at work. They basically, they want to get out of here. So their thing is like, all right, well, we don't want to get caught. We don't want to get killed. We want to go home. Maybe Godzilla can help us out. So they want to wake up Godzilla. So they do that. And then Mothra comes. And in the end, I don't know if it was really the best idea, because the entire island ends up getting destroyed. And I don't know how that really works out. Like the island just crumbles back into the sea. I don't really think islands work like that, but all right. And meanwhile, I mean, it's funny because Ebirah, the creature that this film is named after, kind of isn't really a factor in this story. I mean, there are a couple of, I guess, battles with these monsters as they try to fight Ebirah, but I guess because he's the catalyst, he is the monster that attacks these guys in the boat and starts the whole story going. But this really is kind of a Godzilla movie. It's weird because it's not like Godzilla versus Ebirah or something like that. It's just a strange film. But I liked that it was different enough. And I liked that it didn't focus so much on just monsters tumbling around in the dirt. Which is also funny because this is about a creature that lives in the ocean, but most of this story takes place on land. So I feel like maybe it could have used a better title. Maybe that's all we needed. But otherwise, I mean, this was not as bad as I was thinking. I really thought, at this point, I was starting to expect the worst. And so I was kind of pleased with where we ended up, you know? I can't say it's necessarily a great film on its own, but it was exceeding expectations, I guess. And right after that, we get to Destroy All Monsters from 1968. And this is where I feel like I make note of it because the director of the original film and a few of the early films, Ishiro Honda, he leaves the franchise at some point. And I feel like maybe that's where the film started to take a turn. I don't know. I didn't really connect like which films with which director by each one. But I could feel like, oh, the films start to take a turn and in a way that I'm not really crazy about. And so I make note of like, okay, well, here's the original director coming back to the franchise. Maybe things are going to take a turn for the better, right? And it's funny because it sets up, just from the title, it sets you up as like, okay, we're going to see everything going on here. And it kind of starts out that way. All of the monsters have been gathered up and they're all living together on Monsterland, which, you know, I can't help but think like, oh, is this what inspired Jurassic Park? Because it's kind of what it looks like and kind of what it feels like. The premise is like, well, we got all the creatures and we put them on this one island and that's where they're going to stay. And even though these creatures can swim in the ocean, I don't know why. I mean, they do explain how they can't leave the island, but come on. So, you know, there is an incident that kind of kicks off the story where all of a sudden everything's in chaos. The monsters start leaving the island. Godzilla goes to New York, right? And we even get another kind of alien race that shows up. It's funny, all the aliens in all these films, they all look Japanese to me. I'm just saying. Like, we could do something different, right? You just give them like weird hats or like weird glasses or outfits. That's not really, come on. Use a little more imagination, I think, you know? So here we have these aliens that they're just plotting, right? They're looking for a way to get over on poor Earth. They found a way to take control of the monsters. I don't know, mind control or whatever. But they decide they're going to use all these monsters to basically take over Earth. I feel like we kind of heard this story already, right? I feel like we're seeing a pattern now. Well, we've got all the monsters in play, and then Ghidorah shows up, and then it is a total showdown. Like everybody's in the pool now. I mean, it's crazy. And here's where I feel like a film like this, you would think this is the big one. This is the Avengers, basically, of this entire franchise. We've been leading up to this. Like, let's make this one the best one. And there are parts of this that do kind of feel a little more elevated, I think. But some of I think some of it just comes down to, like, it comes off so corny. And I don't know if that's like just a filmmaking, a sensibility or like a style choice, but it doesn't have weight to it. It feels like total nonsense at some points. Even though there are some interesting themes that are going on, like this idea of fighting against like foreign powers or foreign control and, you know, protecting your home or protecting your homeland. All of those things, I see the threads of it in here, but it gets so wild and weird that I just, I don't know. I don't really know how I feel about this. I wanted to really feel like this was the one. Like all right, I got it. I'm in now. But I just couldn't quite get there. And then, I skip a little bit ahead to 1974 with Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, which now I think we have the third most known villain or character in this franchise. We have Godzilla, of course, but then we get Mothra, then we get Ghidorah, and then Mechagodzilla, which is, kind of mankind's answer, in theory, to something like Godzilla, right? I mean, even though it's not designed by humans in this story, in this version, let's say, it is designed by these aliens that they're sleepers that are here on Earth, and they're still out here plotting, They're still out here scheming. They're trying to do something. And I just felt like, okay, well, this whole thing could have been a little tidier, I think. It could have been put together a little better. And I'll get to some of that in later films, but here, at least the kernel is there of like, oh, it's not just another creature that's going to fight Godzilla or Godzilla's going to have to fight off. Now we have a machine, let's say. And what does that look like? And of course, look, we're talking about 1974. I mean, the special effects, you got to know where you're at, okay? This is not going to look like Pacific Rim. This is not going to look like, Transformers. It's going to look pretty rough. It's going to look like a giant toy. But the idea is there, right? It's like, oh, now we introduce something new. And I feel like that's where it connects in a different way now. Because here it's like a machine. It can have whatever purpose you want it to have, whoever's in control of it, versus another creature, versus Mothra or Ghidorah, who they have their own purpose. They have their own goal, I guess, right? Here, it's like a machine can be whoever is at the reins, whoever is steering can tell it whatever they want it to do. And so here is where we have at least the kernel of the idea. Now, the film itself, this is where I really started to feel like I'm about to tap out, because it does it devolves even further into just fight after fight after fight, and it kind of becomes nonsense. I feel like it just totally goes off the rails at some point. And, maybe it's one of those things you have to see it in its time to really appreciate it, or to feel it, to have the right impact, to watch it today. This is 1974, so we're talking 50 years ago. Maybe it's hard to appreciate it, But look, I mean, 1974, there was some films that still hold up to this day. But this one, I feel like it's absolutely stuck in time. Like, you would not make this film like this today. Something like The Godfather, you might still make that film like that today. I could see that happening. So the next film here is basically the last one in the Showa era, Terror of Mechagodzilla. And it feels like a direct sequel to the previous film, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. I mean, we have kind of a recap of the last moments, the final battle from that film. And so it seems like, all right, well, we're going straight into this next one. And the thing that exhausts me with these films is that we just keep getting more and more creatures or characters, and we focus less on the people. And I'm not saying, look, they've all got to be about the people, but I feel like that's where you can build a story that connects better and holds up more when you have something to relate to. And these films really kind of go away from that. Maybe that's on purpose. Maybe that's by design. But when I see films like that today, that's not a film that I'm going to love and admire and watch and cherish over time. It's just not. So, Terror of Mechagodzilla, they're looking for the wreckage of Mechagodzilla because he got busted up. We get a new monster, the Titanosaurus. And we still have these aliens out here. They're still, still trying to do something. They're rebuilding, coming up with a new plan. And then, of course, we just get monster on monster fights again. It's at this point where I really start to feel like, okay, I think I might be good with this whole project now. I set out to watch all of these films, or as many as I could, and maybe find something new to appreciate, and really open myself up to a genre or a whole lane of films that I just never really put much stock in, But these last few films, they really kind of turned me in the other direction, where I was like, wait. Maybe I was right. Maybe these films are just not very good. And that's something else. It reminds me of something George Lucas said about people's criticisms of the Star Wars prequels, I guess, right? When people who saw the original films in the 70s and 80s, they grew up by the time the prequels came out. And they just immediately felt like these aren't the kinds of films I thought they were going to be. These aren't the kinds of films that I liked when I was young. But meanwhile, George Lucas wasn't young when he made his film. When he made the first Star Wars, he was an adult. And he knew he was making that film for children, right? The themes are deeper and they're more complex than let's say, average children's film. But it is essentially still geared towards a younger audience. The fact that it's so sophisticated and layered and even has some nuance to it, I mean, that's to his credit. But I think that's always been the line that he's toed, is that, yeah, these are films for young people. These are films for children. If you're an adult and you don't enjoy it, it's not for you. And that's a fair statement. I admire someone having the courage to say that when someone's picking apart their work. Because if that was your goal, hey, say it, let it be known. And it makes me think about these Godzilla films. It's like, wait, maybe I'm watching these films wrong. I'm watching them now, 70 years later, as someone in my 40s, and maybe I had to be there, I had to be in the theater in 1964 as like a 12-year-old boy in Japan to really, really get what this film is. And look, I mean, it's fair to say that. I don't feel like there's anything wrong with that being the case. That means I'm not going to be able to enjoy these films or get the same thing out of them as that person, And that's interesting. That's an interesting way to look at films in general. And it's kind of, if anything, that's what I'm taking away from doing this, especially with this franchise, is there's some films that I may just not be able to connect with. And it's not because of something in me or something in the film. It's just those two things they're never going to connect. And that's okay. It's not for me. I've certainly talked about other films here that I've like, I don't think this was made for me. Someone my age, someone from my generation, someone from my culture. This is made for somebody else. And that's fine. That's cool. If I can somehow still cross those hurdles or thresholds and still connect with it somehow, hey, maybe that's good for me. Maybe that's good for the film itself, right? But I have to assume it's not necessarily intended to do that. I think part of it is also, we are so conditioned these days to see films that are designed to hit all four quadrants, right? We're so accustomed to seeing films that are designed to appeal to as many people as possible, including you, including me, that when we see one that doesn't somehow connect with us, it's like, oh, it's a bad film. Maybe not. So I'll give it that. Maybe these aren't necessarily bad films. I just can't get anything out of them for myself. I'm still trying to understand and appreciate the work that went into them, of course. I mean, to think like this was the standard of doing these kinds of visual effects or these kinds of special effects, or even, I mean, there is stunt work in these films. I mean, it's guys in suits and they are rolling around and jumping and fighting and stuff. But it's one of those things that just because of time now, it looks crude and kind of rudimentary, you know? That's not to say that without those films, we would be where we are today. I mean, those films and the work and the craft or the technology or whatever they had to do to make those, you know, that inspired or that informed people that came after them of, oh, here's another way to do this, or here's a better way to do this, or we're going to use that technique for this, you know? So I'm sure there's value here. I know there's value here. I just feel like the ones that really hold up, though, they're kind of far and few between. The original, I think, holds up still pretty well. I mean, it looks like a film from 1954. The creature itself doesn't look so great, but the idea is there. And the way it reads on the people, on the human characters, on their faces, that's what you connect with. And so what we're going to do is, because I'm already running long and we've only gotten to the Showa era, we're going to do a different episode for the other eras, because there's so many films in just this one section of the franchise that, I mean, we're only not even halfway through. So we'll do a different episode for all the others. But the thing that I'm taking away so far is that there are some interesting ways to come at a story and come at a concept or a theme within this very specific kind of niche type of film. But man, it can be really tricky when you dance with that idea of, let's just make it a spectacle. Let's focus on style over substance, because style changes. I mean, it's evident in these films. It's like these films don't really hit like they probably did 70, 60, 50 years ago. The stories could. There are a lot of films that are 70 years old that they still work because the stories are meaningful and thoughtful and have impact. So that's the takeaway, I guess, for now. We'll see what the future holds with the other films in the franchise coming up soon. But, man, this has actually been a trip to do this, to go down through all of these films so far. I think, this is 10 films? This is probably the most films I've done in one episode. And I tell you what, I mean, it was a little daunting at first because I thought, well, I'll go watch all the Godzilla films. But then as I started to count them up, I was like, oh, hell, wait a minute. That's probably a little too much. How many did we do here? We did 9 films. Okay, 9 films. So 9 films in one episode. That's a lot still. But we'll get to more coming up soon. We'll get into maybe more current, more relevant themes. And maybe something more interesting to say. Maybe something I can connect with a little more. So, look, that's it for this episode. If you have some thoughts on Godzilla, if Godzilla is maybe your favorite film franchise, hey, let me know. What am I missing? What film do I need to maybe watch again with different eyes? You know, what do I need to look for? Maybe I skipped a film. I did skip some, I know, but maybe I skipped one that really kind of cracked the code for me, you know? So let me know. Otherwise, hey, go to filmstreak.com. You can find other episodes and do all that. There's a link to the list of all of these films on IMDb. And, you know, like I said, Criterion Channel has all of these currently. They may not forever, but they currently have a collection of all these films on the channel and more. There are some others in here that I didn't get to. But if you're interested in that, go watch them there. So until then, until next time, hey, stay safe and go watch something new.